Hello everyone and welcome back to the Second Party Podcast. My wife and I had two experiences that were quite different, but resulted in both of us kind of coming to a similar conclusion. So today I wanted to talk about what that conclusion was, some of what we learned through these experiences, and hopefully what you could learn as well. To kick us off for today, I think I wanted to hear a story from my wife that she recounted to me recently about an experience she had with art back in high school.
Yeah, so back in high school, I had an elective class that was called, I think it was called digital photography. And I don't remember if I chose this class or if it was kind of selected for me. I remember at the school we went to, sometimes we would get to choose our electives and sometimes they weren't actually elective. They would just get added to our schedule, and we didn't have a say in it. But I was in this digital photography class in high school, and I think it had to have been maybe 9th or 10th grade, so I was probably 13 or 14 at the time, something like that. And I was actually looking forward to this class because I kind of saw myself as a pretty good photographer at the time. I had some confidence with my photography skills that were probably unfounded. Well, I later learned they were pretty unfounded. But, I had the first iPod with a camera, so I was always taking pictures all the time. And
The 2 megapixel camera.
Oh, yeah.
Or whatever it was back.
It's like the pictures of Bigfoot are better than the pictures I could get out of that camera. But so I was looking forward to this class, and it was pretty fun, especially I think it was in the fall semester. So a lot of the class was we would kind of just wander around the school and like take pictures of random things. It was pretty fun. So I got to hang out with my friends and we would wander around, and I brought like my digital camera to school. So I was kind of having fun in this photography class. And then one of the assignments we got, the teacher gave us a list of professional photographers to choose from. And what we had to do was select a photographer, take a look at some of their art, and, learn about the style of their art and try to take a picture to replicate the style of their photography. So I was looking through this list of photographers, and some of them they looked very difficult to recreate. One of the photographers was Annie Leibovitz, and I remember looking at some of her photos from the Disney series, which I think was the one that we were supposed to be selecting if we chose her. Mm-hmm. And I mean, they're beautiful photos. They're very fantastical looking, very fairy tale princessy, beautiful photos that I was like, I can't replicate something like that. Like I'm not gonna pick her. Yeah. So I was basically looking for the easiest one I could find. And I came across this American photographer called Gregory Crutzen. And specifically, he has a series of photos that I don't remember what the name of the series was, but they were basically just a bunch of pictures of very normal scenes you would find in America on street corners and stuff. Mm-hmm. And they're all kind of taken at twilight, right after sunset, basically. So, sometimes the sky would be a little bit pink or just have a little bit of light left in it. Mm-hmm. And there would usually be, some kind of like car parked on the street or someone in the street, and there would be telephone poles across the frame and some houses or trees or lamp posts or something. It was a very normal scene. Yeah. And I remember looking through these photos and just thinking, well, this looks like something I could just snap on my walk home from the park. Like, this is a very normal thing. This looks like kind of where I live. Like, this doesn't look difficult at all. I'm going to pick this guy. And maybe for the YouTube portion of this, I'll throw some of the pictures up there for inspiration of some of his photos here. But I just thought they looked really easy, and I thought I could do it no problem. So I got into studying some of his photos, taking a look at them, planning out how I was gonna get this shot, and I had my dad drive me to a street in the city that I live in that kind of had a lot of power lines, because that's really the thing that I noticed in his photos is these power lines. And I just started snapping shots, and I was like, all right, look at me go. I like did this in 10 minutes. This was like the easiest thing ever. And one of them I even like had a car in the background, and the car like had its headlights on at one point, and I snapped that picture, and I was like, that's the one. Like, that is gonna belong in like an art museum. This is perfect. It's fitting right in with the with what this is supposed to do. I'm gonna like ace this assignment. And so, I brought this back, and part of the class was we were learning about how to use Adobe Photoshop. So I got this photo, and I started doing stuff in Photoshop, and I thought things were looking good, and I like got the photo to where, the lighting looked right and the exposure and all these things. And I was like, I think I maybe got it. And then I pulled up some of his pictures to like look at it next to my photo, and I realized this photo that I took is terrible. Like, it is actually terrible. Everything's off.
Yeah.
Everything's off. The light is not right. It's not balanced. Like, I didn't know how to explain it, but it just was awful. And if you promise not to laugh at me, I might put this photo up so on the YouTube portion of this so everyone can see it. But it was an awful picture. And I didn't realize it until I put it up next to these other pictures. And then as I was looking at this picture, I was like so ashamed. Like, I can't show this in front of the whole class. Like, this looks so bad. And so at that point, I started taking a look at his photos again, and I was noticing things that I never saw before. After I had tried to replicate it. And I noticed all these intricacies, the light shining out of some of the buildings, and the way that the light reflected perfectly off of the wet ground in this area, and how everything was balanced, and it just felt soft. And I just remember like looking at these pictures and thinking, I thought this was gonna be so easy.
Yeah.
It's just a normal street corner, right? Like, it looks so normal to me, but I can't make my picture look like that. So sitting there wondering, what am I gonna do? Because my picture's horrible, and I have to present this to the class. I basically decide to kind of tell the truth about what happened. So I get up there with my presentation, I show some of his pictures, and I show my picture, and I basically say in front of the whole class, the lesson I learned here, because my picture's horrible, and I did what I thought was my best to try and replicate one of his pictures, but I realized like there's a lot more that goes into this photography than I thought. And I picked this guy because I thought it would be so easy. But now that I've tried to recreate it, like, I see a beauty in these photos of his that I didn't recognize at first because I went and tried to do it myself. And I gained an appreciation for the work that he's doing in his pictures that I clearly did not have when I was just looking through them at first. So that was the lesson that I learned from that, and my teacher kind of ate that up. She loved that. But it was the truth. It was the truth about what I learned in that instance. So with these photos from this guy, definitely gave me a greater appreciation for the underrated or simplistic beauty in them. And I look at these photos now, and they really are beautiful photos. They are really nice. And I recognize that a lot better than I ever did before that assignment.
Yeah, there's definitely a charm and a uniqueness and like a deep visceral feeling that I think each photo really captures well.
Yeah, it's difficult to explain, but I think that's kind of what art is supposed to do. It's supposed to make you feel something or help explain something that words can't.
Yeah. As I alluded to earlier, I had a somewhat similar experience. Right around the same time, the song Sexy and I Know It by LMFAO was getting really popular. And I remember thinking to myself, like, this is just another one of those one-hit wonder silly songs that everyone gets on board with, and it gets viral for
no
a year.
reason.
And
dumb lyrics.
And then 1 year later, pretty much everyone has forgotten about it and we're on to the next thing, right? And I remember talking to my friends about it, saying essentially the song sucks or it's a one-hit wonder kind of thing. And I think two things were true at once. One is that the song is not some unbelievable, wonderful, amazing work of art. Right? It's not.
It's no Mona Lisa or
Yeah.
Beethoven or.
Yeah, it's not paving new ground and really speaking to the nature of the human condition in some way. It's a fun, kind of silly club song. But I was ripping into it so much that I think one of my friends just annoyed and fed up with my comments on this song said something along the lines of, yeah, well, if it's so bad and they made all this money on it, why don't you just go do that? And
it's a fair question.
Like, yeah, it's totally a fair question. Now, I don't think that it was, the way I remember it, the comment wasn't this insightful Socratic method way of getting me to understand that there was something more complicated going on. I think that they were just kind of sick of it and thought that I was being stupid and annoying. But I thought to myself, you know what? This person's got a point. Like, why don't I just go make this song? Why don't I go make some catchy song and have it go viral or whatever and
retire?
Yeah.
Drop out of school?
Basically. Now, I didn't go into this with the mentality that, like, that's exactly what was going to happen. But I thought to myself, like, come on, I could make something better at least, right? Maybe it doesn't end up going as big or get catchy, but there's obviously some luck involved in the popularity of things and things going viral or not, right? So I thought to myself, well, I'll make a song that's better and have some fun with it to prove a couple folks wrong or something like that, right? One thing I should mention with this is I lack the ability to play any musical instrument.
Or even read music.
I can't sing. And I would hesitate to even say a surface level understanding of reading music. So I'm going into this thinking, yeah, well, I'll just make a song. So I sat down and opened up my laptop. I fired up GarageBand at the time and started putting some things together and started listening to it, and I thought, okay, we're on to something here. We're making some good progress. Things are coming along. Started with kind of like a bass line, just real simple stuff, and a few layers, and in my head I'm thinking, yeah, this is coming together. And I get to a point where I'm going to start recording, I think it's like some audio for somebody singing in the background. I think to myself, like, come on, I can't be doing this singing. I suck at singing. So I kind of put it on the back burner. I just save it and close it down, and I'll come back to it a bit later. I don't recall what happened. Maybe school got busy or I was doing sports or what have you, but maybe 2 or 3 weeks went by and I came back to my laptop after having some free time and I opened it up and thought, oh yeah, I had that song. And I'm a really big music fanatic, so I'd been listening to music throughout that day up till that point. And I opened up GarageBand and just to refresh myself on where I was at before, and I'd give the song a bit of a listen through. And when I got to the end, I just thought to myself, this is absolutely abysmal. Like, we've gotten almost nowhere. There's not great flow to this. It's so simple. Like, this is the equivalent of having a baby just slapping its hands on a keyboard. Like, it was just terrible.
It's like the worst Disney Channel song is like miles ahead of this one.
Yeah, and I remember just thinking to myself, because I was comparing my song, my ultimate goal was to try and do something that was somewhere approximating the song Sexy and I Know It. So just a standard issue pop song. So even with these really, really low goals that I had, it still was just terrible. It paled in comparison to even what I considered to be a mediocre to bad pop song at the time.
Well, and those moments of realization I think are so interesting because you go into it like so naive and you think you're just gonna trot through a hilly meadow and it's gonna be amazing, and then you just get slapped with like this massive cliff and you realize this is a lot bigger of a climb than I thought this was gonna be. Like,
Yeah.
and it's just like makes you want to give up. And I gave up on my photo after I did the first one, and I was overwhelmed with my own inability to make anything that comes close.
Yeah. It's I think the word I'd use is humbling. It's really humbling
Oh,
to
for
sit
sure.
here and like just kind of rip into or criticize something and then try and do it better. And I think the photographer that you were attempting to emulate in terms of photographers, right? It's relatively well known.
I
He
mean,
makes
I had not heard of him before that class, but I was
yeah,
also
but
like 13, so
yeah, but how many photographers did you know at the time, right?
yeah, not many.
And he's making this list, so he's in the top however many photographers at the time approximately that you're attempting to emulate. So right, you're comparing yourself to some of the best at least.
Someone who already has an established name for
Yeah.
themselves.
Versus like I'm comparing myself to bottom of the barrel pop music at the time, and still I felt like it was so unbelievably wildly inadequate.
Mm-hmm.
It was really humbling, and I came out of this with I think just like a very different new perspective, which is I'm not going to refrain from criticizing pop music because I couldn't do better. I think that's a bad argument. But I came out of it with a realization that even the music and the art that I don't think is good is still markedly better than I could do, and that's not even to mention some of the absolutely expertly crafted really amazing music that's made out there. Art's in many things, but I think when we're talking about art here, I think we're referring to something that's like primarily art. So something that's like 80% art or more.
So what do you mean when you say art here?
That's a great question. I think people oftentimes don't understand art. And with that, they also don't understand kind of the creative aspect to it. And I think that's probably because it's not something that is totally natural to most people. And I think that, that's really evident in some of the experiences that we just talked about, where we both sat here and thought, oh, well, this is going to be super easy. This aspect of art is going to be so easy. And then we got into it and realized just how difficult it is. So I think that question of like, what is art is one that people should be asking more. I think there are a few things that make up art. I think people really don't understand what art should do. They don't understand some of the rules that guide art. They're not good judges of art. They often don't even realize or notice what is art, yet alone what's good or bad art.
Well, and I think part of the challenge is art is so subjective just by its nature.
I
And
think
that's one of the things that's beautiful about it in a sense because it can carry meaning that could differ person to person.
yeah.
But it is subjective, right? I mean, if I'm painting my wall and I spill paint all over the floor, that's a horrible mess I have to clean up. An artist in a shop spilling paint all over a canvas can be a beautiful piece of art.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely an objective aspect to art, but you're definitely right that that a large component of it is subjective. I think this may sound cliche, but I think art should really make us fundamentally like feel something. Sometimes people will come in and they'll explain art, and I think sometimes that's productive, as long as after that explanation you feel something as well.
So is my spilled wall paint art because it makes me feel frustration?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think there are a number of different additional aspects to art. So, like, I think art at its core should be fundamentally expressing something that goes beyond what mere, like, direct words can express. So even something like a Shakespearean play, that, at least in how we're oftentimes experiencing it nowadays, is written down, or a book, right? These are written words, but they're expressing something that goes deeper, that goes beyond merely what these words are directly communicating, right?
Right. I mean, poetry, like, too. Poetry is words, but I would say it's a form of art.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And my thing with the spilled paint, like, depending on the context, like, that could be considered art.
It could be. Yeah, depending
I mean,
on the
you
context.
get weird stuff with ultra modernist art that's like a banana taped to the wall, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we can discuss that, but I think one of the interesting things about art is it's like almost anything can be art.
Yeah, I think part of the issue with some of those, like, modern pieces of art, a banana taped to a wall, a canvas that's all one color.
A new shade of blue that's never been seen before.
Yeah, I think ultimately the issue that I see with some of those is people will come through and they'll give some explanation to it.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said before, like, I don't think that needing to explain art makes it any less valuable. But I think after that explanation, you need to have some kind of feeling. And oftentimes, that feeling that the art exhibits is not, it isn't there.
Well, and there
with some
needs
of
to
those
be
modern art pieces.
there needs to be some perceivable link between that explanation and the art itself. But it's like you could sit here and you could say, well, my banana taped to the wall is an expression of the absurdity of modern art. Then it could be considered art, right?
Yeah, I guess I just think, like, if it doesn't make you feel something, I think that's a big kind of red flag in the art itself. I think another thing is, like, most art, I think, should kind of allow for a level of, like, sympathy and empathy and connection. And I think it should speak to something kind of beyond, something more complicated. And at times, like, something to the nth degree. So something that is, like, almost heavenly, or something that's almost hellish. And I think the problem with some of the modern art is it's almost taking this, like, political take, and I'm, when I say political, I mean, like, political in the art world. Like, it's making a commentary on the politics of art, and I don't find that compelling oftentimes. And I don't think that most people are emotionally moved by that. You know, I don't think it's like an exploration of creation itself. I think fundamentally what people are doing in art is pulling something out of nothing and tapping into that which at the beginning of time created something out of nothing. And I think that's part of what we're doing when we're making art. And that's like a powerful thing. That's why it ends up being so, like, real and visceral and raw and unique. And I think too often it's almost like the agenda is coming before the art itself. Like, when art is created with like a known articulable agenda in mind, why use art as the medium? Like, art is supposed to be this, like, visceral, raw, expressive way of communicating an idea that you can't articulate directly with words. So if you can articulate it directly with words in its entirety, then why are we creating art? Otherwise, like it feels almost like holier than thou or righteous or pandering. And to me, that's oftentimes what the modern art ends up like. Like you could write an essay on what this painted white canvas is supposed to represent. And that would more than fully encapsulate the art itself. Versus, like, you can't write an essay that fully expresses and gives the same experience that the Mona Lisa does, or that Starry Night does, or that listening to a song, one of your favorite songs does.
Right, or film or something.
Yeah, or the pictures that you were trying to emulate. You can't write an essay on that and elicit the same feelings, elicit the same emotions, communicate all of what's being communicated there. You can't do it with mere words. And I think too often the modern art, especially stuff that's created with an agenda in mind, it doesn't land in that same way because of that.
Do you think that maybe part of it is that art has to be sensory in some way? So something that you see or something you hear versus like, you know, what you're saying where you're just communicating an idea on a paper. Like, okay, yeah, you see the words on the paper, but it's not there for you to enjoy how the letters look printed. It's there for you to read and process in your mind.
I think if you're speaking in a more metaphorical sense, yes. So I would maybe describe it as more of like art is more of an experience than people realize. When I hear sensory, I think a little bit more like scientifically.
I guess I mean sensory, like something you see, something you hear, smell, touch.
I don't necessarily think so then, because there's plenty of art that's made in like the written format, like in books, but it's that's expressing something and speaking to something deeper than what you could using words directly.
Like a play or something, you mean?
Yeah.
You would consider that art?
Yeah, like Romeo and Juliet, whether you're seeing it acted out or you're reading the play on a piece of paper, I think in either case it's still this wondrous piece of art, but reading through it even is an experience, and it's speaking to things, and it's doing so indirectly, and I think most importantly it's doing so indirectly because that's the only way that those ideas can properly be expressed. Like, I can't sit here and explain to you everything that Romeo and Juliet is attempting to communicate.
Sure.
Not adequately, at least.
Right. It's like that's the purpose of stories, right?
Yeah.
If you could just get the whole point across, then stories would serve no purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking like I'm not saying that I have some idea. I'm just kind of thinking out loud, I guess, but when you think about poetry or a lot of written pieces of art, if you want to call it art, like there is a sense of visual structure to it. Like it's not just words in a text edit file, right? It's like the words have been written down, they have been organized into stanzas, they've been, you know, separated into paragraphs and sections with dialogue, and like there is a level of visual structure to even words when you're reading them, and that visual structure conveys meaning too.
So I think some things are like that. So if you look at, what's that really popular poetry book, Where the Sidewalk Ends?
Sven Silverstein, is that the name?
Is it Shel Silverstein?
Shel Silverstein?
He wrote The Giver as well then. Or, sorry. He wrote The Giving Tree as well. So Where the Sidewalk Ends.
Shel Silverstein.
Yeah.
He wrote The Giving Tree?
Yeah.
Yeah, he did. Huh.
Yeah,
I never made that connection that those two were the same.
yeah, well, the artistic styles are pretty similar.
Yeah, no, it makes
actually.
sense now that I'm thinking back on it.
Well, anyway, if I'm remembering correctly, many of the poems in that book, the placement of the words on a page
Yeah.
is critical. So you'll
They're-
have like a down, 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 and those will be structured in like upper left and then middle and then lower right.
Right. There's visual art to the
Yeah.
placement of the words as
Yeah.
well.
But what I'm saying is something like Romeo and Juliet, that can be broken down into essentially a text edit file. Like,
Sure. I mean,
have
it
you
is...
viewed the original manuscripts, the original?
Well, I've read it in the format of, how it's formatted as a play, where you have acts and you have sections and you have the dialogue and you have...
Sure, but my point is that can be a text edit file. That was your example. It can literally be broken down to a text
I just mean
file.
text edit file in terms of like just words in a continuous line. When you're typing in text edit and it's just a word that goes on and on. It's not arranged in any way. It's not organized. It's just words one after another in a big block.
I don't know that would lose much meaning. I think the meaning comes from
I'm not saying that
what's being communicated.
I'm not saying that it would in the case of Romeo and Juliet. I'm just kind of pondering and also noting that written art oftentimes does come with some kind of structure.
Yeah, you're right. There's usually some kind of structure. I mean, to all art, I think there's some structure. There's some rules that kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say need to be abided by, but oftentimes are abided by. And I think oftentimes people don't understand those rules when they are making art for the first time. And there's kind of a curve that I see where initially you don't understand the rules and your art sucks, and then you understand the rules, and as you grow and you understand more about the art and you work within the rules and you make like decent or solid art. But then I think there's a point past that where you understand the rules and are able to bend them in some ways or break them in some ways to really communicate an idea. And to me, that's like the level of mastery with something. So, for instance, we'll go back to your photography example. In photography, one of the quintessential rules for making something aesthetically pleasing is like the rule of thirds.
Mm-hmm.
There are different uses of color. There's a whole field of study of color theory,
right,
where one can understand what colors look good or in what colors elicit what emotions. But there are times when you can break those rules and do so in a way intentionally to communicate something. So something that comes to mind is like the album cover for Kanye West's The Life of Pablo album. Like this is an album that is not in any way like aesthetically pleasing
it
necessarily.
looks awful. Like it actually looks awful.
Yeah, it looks like somebody made it in like Microsoft Paint.
Well, it's the style of those like memes that were popular in like 2013, right? Or whatever. Where it's just random like Comic Sans text all over with random things, and it's just
but it leads into the album itself. There's this kind of chaotic madness of sorts, and if I recall correctly, at least the cover that I have and like it's been changed on multiple instances, but there's like a pixelated image of a woman's butt kind of, and then there's also this image of I think it's Kanye and his family, but it's a family at the same time, And many of the themes on the album touch on like more sexually explicit content, but then there's also this background of like Christianity and Christian references and family, and like it's kind of a weird dichotomy that's represented on the album cover, despite the album cover not being aesthetically pleasing in any capacity.
Well, isn't that is that the album he described as a gospel album with a whole lot of cussing or something like that?
I think it was described in that way, yes. Yeah.
But I just think like when you break some of those molds or you break some of the rules, like it has to be for a purpose, right? You can't just break rules just to break rules.
Well, and I think the other thing is like there's a clear understanding of what the rules are.
Right.
Right, because it's right
Otherwise
here.
Otherwise, it wouldn't be breaking them.
Yeah, but also that album cover is not. It's not like a minor violation of the, let's say, rules of layout and design, right? It's not a minor violation of that. It's a major, very in-your-face violation of that rule, while at the same time still adhering to a couple other layout rules. Mm-hmm. And I think like there's a level of chaos, but there's also a level of like groundedness to it, because you recognize, oh, there's some understanding of the rule here, but there's so much violation of the rule here, and it creates an interesting dichotomy. I think only when you fully understand that rule can you really go about violating it. So another example of, like violating a rule, I think came up with, it kind of came to my attention from a YouTube channel. It's Quove's Studio, and their video is titled, "Do Scars Really Make Men More Attractive? What Makes an Attractive Face?" And they talk a lot about what people are attracted to, what's visually appealing to people. So one of the surface level things that people understand pretty readily is having like a symmetrical face is generally seen as more attractive. Well, what they were kind of diving into on that topic was whether or not like a facial scar makes somebody more attractive. You see this a lot with characters in movies, especially male characters in movies, where they'll have a scar that's obviously asymmetrical on their face. Yeah, so like Anakin Skywalker in Star Wars is a great example of this, like in episode 3 when he's
got that slash across his eye.
Yeah, you see that with somebody who they bring up in the video. It's another great example is Jason Momoa. And what they talked about was how having a relatively symmetrical face and then having that kind of portion of asymmetry, and how that asymmetry comes in, which is specifically via a scar, is advantageous, again, specifically for men.
Okay.
And
that's not really surprising to me. Like, I get it.
Yeah, it's not necessarily surprising, and yeah, you're right, it definitely makes sense, but it's interesting to think about. Like, that's something that is originally a rule, but is totally violated here.
Or, like, certain birthmarks sometimes.
Yeah, so that was actually the example that I had primarily for women. So for men, the scar seems to exhibit a sense of like having survived some altercation,
strength,
likely physical. Yeah, and that's something that women tend to look for in men. And in my mind, the female kind of antithesis to that, because as he details in the video, the same is not necessarily true for women who have a scar. The antithesis to that is, yeah, like a birthmark or a beauty mark. Mm-hmm. Some really high profile celebrities have birthmarks or beauty marks that are pretty standout. And I think a great example of this, like taking it out of the human context, but there are certain things on cars. Cars are something that's very symmetrical left to right because they're manufactured. They can be almost identical, save like interior driving positions and stuff like that. You don't see cars where it has one right headlight and a different left headlight.
Right.
However, there's one instance that I've noticed where cars are oftentimes asymmetrical, and it's on the rear end of a vehicle. Think about when you're looking at
With the exhaust.
like a name of a vehicle.
Like the logo or the name on the side?
So, like on the rear of the vehicle, it's usually on like a bumper or the trunk or boot for those in Britain. You've got some form of label. Usually it's the name of the vehicle. So you'd get like, if it's a Honda Accord, it would say Accord.
Or like Eco Turbo, like something
Yeah,
like
sometimes
that.
you get that. But oftentimes sometimes you'll see it where they're symmetrical, but oftentimes it'll be asymmetrical. Similarly, what you'll get sometimes is in the grille area of a vehicle, there will be a marker for something that's performance. So for BMW, you'll have these 3 slashes if it's an M car, and sometimes that'll be represented in the logo. Or Mercedes vehicles, sometimes the AMG variants, again, a high performance variant, will have a little AMG logo there. Mm-hmm. Same can be true sometimes for Audi and their RS line, or Volvo and their Polestar line. But in any case, you have this kind of asymmetrical feature that's almost like a beauty mark of sorts, and it's specifically done most often, I would say, on high performance variants.
Well, it's just an interesting idea about there being this really profound or unexplainable sense of beauty in the slight imperfections of something.
Yeah, I think that's another portion of art. There's a need to have a level of imperfection and a level of something like unique, something different.
This is kind of reminding me of a thread I saw on Twitter recently that I don't know that I talked to you about this before, so curious your thoughts on it. But it was basically a thread where someone was criticizing, I can't remember exactly, and I don't know that I can find it really quickly here, but someone was criticizing like hyper-realism art.
Okay. Yeah.
And basically saying that, like, kind of what we were just talking about, it's like you haven't done anything other than just try to replicate something as it is. Mm-hmm. You haven't added any value or any meaning into something. Mm-hmm. And it was an interesting thread. Like, I don't know that I necessarily agree with all of it, because I've always really liked hyperrealism, like, drawings. I find them really amazing. Mm-hmm. And you obviously need a lot of skill to do that. But it was an interesting perspective just on what's the point of this art. You aren't adding any creative insight into this.
Yeah, you're not sharing your mental perspective
right
with anyone else, really.
Right. You aren't doing anything creative. And by creative, like, creating something, which means something new or unique.
Something new.
It's like you are looking at something and you are dissecting it into, like, the objective elements of what it is, mm-hmm. and you're just copy pasting, which I thought was an interesting perspective on that kind of art. I mean, I still see, like, certain value in that kind of art personally. I find it really impressive.
Yeah, me too.
But I understand that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. You kind of have different eras of art, right? Where a particular style dominates, right? And I think the ultra realism style of art has something important to say, right? I think it's representative of, like, a scientific, more observational age. But I also definitely understand some of the criticisms there. I think no matter what art, an artist's perspective will bleed through at least a little bit. But to their point, I definitely think that art that is clearly illustrating someone's perspective is much more interesting.
Well, and I would even say there's potentially a difference you could argue between the type of hyperrealism where it's like here's this picture of Ariana Grande or whatever, and I'm gonna draw something that looks exactly like that. Like I just photocopied this, but I drew it myself.
Yeah.
Like that's hyperrealism, but that's not you creating anything. That's you making a copy of something. Versus hyperrealism art, where like you are actually creating your own original piece.
Yeah.
Like you could be creating,
it's in a realistic style.
It could look hyper realistic, but it's of a person who doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Or it's of a scene that has never actually happened. Or, you know, I don't know that Bob Ross stuff would be considered hyper realism, but it's relatively,
I mean, it's a bit closer.
It's not hyper realism, but even like the art that he does, he's not just copying something he saw exactly. Like he is inserting his own vision. He's creating a scene that may or may not actually exist in reality, but it's coming out of his mind.
Yeah. I mean, so when I think about art and kind of a unique nature to it, something that's standout, something that's different, one of the most quintessential paintings that I think one could argue is a little bit more on the realistic side is like the Mona Lisa. Right?
Yeah. And it's not hyper realism like what I'm talking about with pencil drawings and stuff.
Yeah, I know. But it's much more, it's much more on the realistic side than a typical Van Gogh.
Right.
Right. And I think what really captivates people, obviously there are a number of aspects here, but I think one of the things that really captivates people is just how peculiar her face is. Like the facial expression is so wildly unclear. Her eyes look very like almost, like, dare I say, like depressed or dead in a way. Her forehead looks like fake, and yet there's this like weird level of like devious life in her smile, and it's a very odd look. It's a very odd dichotomy there.
It is strange. I know some people describe her as like a very beautiful woman.
Yeah.
It is strange.
It's odd.
Personally, I've never really like gotten to the point where I've really recognized or probably fully appreciated the Mona Lisa. It's never really struck a chord with me.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been to the Louvre, but like looking at it now, I understand that it's wildly unique in one way, right? It's one of those things that you're not able to like take your eyes off. It's just so interesting. Like we've kind of talked about this before, actually. Sometimes I'll watch somebody and I'm not great with names, but I'm very observational with people. People always say, "Oh, I'm great with faces." I almost always recognize people's faces and can tell you what else they're from, whether it's an actor or actress. I can name the 5 other movies that I've seen a given actor in, but I don't remember the individual's name most of the time. But the other thing that I always focus on is mannerisms or feelings that somebody elicits, and I'll describe them to you. So let's say one of my descriptions of somebody was, it looks like they always have something that they're hiding and they're nervous that you'll find out. And you knew.
It's just a mannerism.
Yeah. It's just like a mannerism or a way that somebody carries themselves. And that coupled with like the hair color and it's
the context of where you saw them, and then I knew who
you
were talking
you knew
about.
exactly. And yet this was like the first time that I had ever mentioned this person in that way. It wasn't as if I was referring to a previous conversation. And I think that oftentimes the things that capture our attention are just so interesting to us, especially from an art perspective, are things like that. Like when I look at the Mona Lisa and like everything that comes together, the hand placement, the hair, how it's so flat at the top and kind of wispy and odd on the sides, and how the face seems to be expressing like multiple different emotions at once. Or you look at Van Gogh's Starry Night and it's this weird like flowing nature to the sky, and the way that it's painted is just so unique, and the use of color and how it's primarily blue, and yet and completely understand that this is like deep in the night, I think is so interesting. And it's because it's got like this wildly unique aspect to it. And I think that is also what helps propagate like memes nowadays. Right? It's these things, it's these lines that just grab you. They're just so peculiar or odd or different in a way. And to me, that right there, people will point this out as a negative in certain movies. And the quintessential example, in my mind, of peculiar, odd things being pointed out and people saying it's a negative, but really that to me is what makes it so iconic and amazing, is Star Wars. The number of lines in Star Wars that are so iconic, and it seems like people are just divided on these, whether they're so cringy and terrible or unique and captivating.
Mm-hmm.
It's so interesting to me. I think Star Wars is like the quintessential or a quintessential movie example of this.
Yeah, the thing I was thinking about with the memes is like sometimes memes just honestly express an emotion that or gifs. I think it's GIF, but express an emotion that it's like I don't know how else to express that to someone over text.
It's
right?
so
like,
visceral.
When I
like
send
that dude with the shaking head and the eyes that open.
Yeah, that's my favorite meme.
We'll put it in the YouTube video.
Or the Pikachu being surprised.
Yeah.
It's just, how else are you gonna express that? And it's like all of us together, we have a communal understanding of like what that means.
Yeah.
Right? Like the girl in the car seat who's, I don't even know what it's called, but she's like,
she's like disgusted. Kind of like disgusted and taken aback, and she's like 4 or something. Yeah.
It's just a picture, but it's like been given this meaning that like we can all share in some collective understanding of that.
Yeah.
I also was thinking about how I do wonder sometimes with things like, the Mona Lisa and paintings like that, how much, if at all, would the experience of looking at that painting change if you were doing so in person versus, a rendering online?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer. It probably depends on the art, but I've never seen the Mona Lisa in person. I've never seen Starry Night in person, but...
Well, I was at an art museum a little while back with a couple of my friends, and there was this marble sculpture by Raffaello Monti, and just seeing it in person, like I'm looking at a picture of it now, and it's very beautiful, but seeing it in person was just so stunning, so mind-boggling at the accuracy and the emotion that it conveyed was just substantially more in person. Now, pictures also convey a crazy level of emotion with it, but in person, to your point, it was so radically different, so much more.
Right. Well, it's like, when you're looking at the moon in the night sky, or a sunset that looks beautiful, and it's just like so beautiful you can't stop looking at it, and then you go and you try to take a picture of it.
Yeah.
And you look on your phone and just the picture looks like crap.
Yeah, it's just like,
right.
This is not the same usually, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how much that applies to art. It probably does depend, but...
Yeah. But I think whether it's like a sunset or like when we were talking about memes earlier, I think there's a lot of art actually that people don't even realize is art, or people don't even realize how much time and creativity went into it. Like when I look at something like, I'm a big LaCroix fan, and when I look at something like these cans, yeah, each one of them, each different flavor has got a different color, but it goes beyond that. There are different like sheens to the cans. There are different illustrations on them, and all of that's not even to mention like the LaCroix logo itself, right? It's this very abstract. No, that's not the right word. It's this very unique, almost like painted or scratched in logo. It's not this modern text
Kind of whimsical
logo. Yeah, it's somewhat whimsical in a way. It's kind of raw, kind of almost like it was written in like a rock or something. It's very interesting. It's very different. And I'm not saying that the LaCroix bottles and that the LaCroix cans and branding and stuff is so superior to other things. Like an original Coke bottle is designed based on the ingredient of the cola nut. So that's why like those ribs on the side.
Okay.
That's to elicit like a feeling of the cola nut, and the aesthetic and the curves of the bottle are designed to look as much like that nut as possible while still having like this aesthetically pleasing bottle. It was intentionally designed in that way, and that's why like when you see in the commercials, even if you have like a can of Coke, right, you get this silhouette of that bottle that comes up in the ads as it rotates onto the screen. Like all of these things are so expertly and intentionally designed. Even something like the Apple logo. Like somebody spent so much time on this, the Nike swoosh. These are things that like a designer sat down and they drew out this, and they had the brand idea in their mind, right? Apple, it's this simple logo. It's straightforward. It's as boiled down as you can to the essence of an apple, which
It's like perfectly balanced, very aesthetically pleasing.
and it's emblematic of the brand. It's this upscale kind of cachet, industrial, modern design. Like even something like you look at an iPhone or a Mac, and these things are thoughtfully and painstakingly designed. People will argue all the time about, oh, like they shouldn't have made this sacrifice for design's sake. Well, that's fine, but these designs take sacrifices, and that's what you're getting with Apple. And they've sacrificed plenty of things all the time to achieve a specific design, whether that's making something thin or making something a specific color, just the perfect shade, or lighting up an Apple logo in a specific way. Like they spend tons of painstaking hours and R&D time honing this as much as possible. I think so often people don't recognize the art that's around them.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the other thing I was just thinking about is, well, do you think that art is characteristic of humanity? Like, isn't it interesting or compelling that like humans are capable of creating art in a way that, you know, like is a penguin capable of creating art? I would say no. Right. And why?
I don't know that much about penguins, but not to the same level that humans are.
I would say no, because
close.
Isn't like one of the characteristics of art, in my mind at least, that there has to be some sense of like creative, intelligent life behind it. Right?
Yeah,
like when you see something that's designed specifically, that's conveying a meaning, there has to be someone who has made it to convey that meaning. When you see something beautiful or ordered or artistic in some way, that it's characteristic of a creative being, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are birds that outline and bring certain objects into their nest and like painstakingly put them in like aesthetically pleasing places to attract mates. So I don't think that it's something that is 100% entirely unique to humans, but certainly the extent to which we do it and the unbelievable and increasing depth that art seems to have and how much it speaks to like the human condition and the nature of reality, I think is unparalleled.
Yeah, well, I think in the instance with the birds, I mean, I guess it kind of goes back to, well, what do you mean when you say art? Like, how do you define art? But
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely argue that the bird's doing this for direct utilitarian purposes rather than to speak to some
purely
greater
visual,
meaning.
yeah.
Yeah, like
And I think the argument that I think I could make is that, like, no, birds can't do art because part of art, something that necessitates the creation of art, is an intelligent life that is behind it, trying to communicate meaning. And I mean, the way I see it, I see that for humans as being something that's part of how we are set apart from animals or made in the image of God. We are meant to reflect his creative nature, and that's something that's unique to us that isn't to any other species.
yeah, I mean, especially to the extent that it is. Yeah.
So, like in the instance with the bird, I don't know that I would say that the bird is creating art so much as maybe the bird itself is a piece of art. There is an intelligent life behind the creation of that bird and everything it's doing. Just like I would say there's intelligence behind the creation of every beautiful artistic thing you see in nature.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really a question of extent.
Yeah, I'm just saying I think that's an argument I could make. I would probably define art as needing some intelligent life behind it.
I think often though, even people don't understand art.
Oh, of course not. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like we kind of talked about earlier, we are oftentimes so bad at art. And I would argue not only are we so bad at art, but we oftentimes are so bad that we struggle to even have the ability to properly judge art. Not even that we have that creation aspect to us, but that oftentimes people struggle to even take that first step before you articulate or make art. They struggle to take that first step of even judging or understanding or recognizing art.
Right. Or some of the value behind it. Like art is not a meaningless or a pointless medium.
No, not at all.
And dismissing it as such, I think, is doing a grave injustice, not just to, all the art itself, but also to your own intellect, your own creative abilities as a human. You're almost rejecting a part of yourself if you're not recognizing the value of art.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. What I find so interesting about art is that at times, we can view something and we can have this visceral feeling. And this is something I think is so cool about art. We can have this visceral feeling and we can understand that like it's meaningful. And we can understand that like we love it or that it's so interesting and it's captivating. But simultaneously lack the ability to express why that is. I think a great example of this is like everyone recognizes what makes a car unique or different. And I think oftentimes people are able to recognize what makes a car beautiful versus cool looking, right? So we could take something like, just as an example, like a Honda Civic Type R. And like that's something that catches people's eye. It's super cool looking. It's very different. It's wild. It's out there, right? But I and most people, I think, would agree that while that's wild and crazy, if you put that up next to a Ferrari 458, the Ferrari 458 is much more beautiful, I would say. And even if you want to take two things in the same like caliber or price bracket or something, even comparable things we're able to say like, oh, this is much more like beautiful and this is more like fun, I guess, but it doesn't tick that like beautiful box. There's a great channel that we'll link called the Sketch Monkey. He's got a second channel called Bembly, and on both channels he kind of talks about car design and kind of some of the principles behind that, kind of like what we were talking about with photos, where there are certain rules, right? Like with the rule of thirds, and he talks about that in car design. I think it's really interesting to see, and to put on that totally different perspective, to be able to view that style of art in just like a very different way. I think that getting a better understanding of things like that can help us better understand our own abilities. Like I think about,
And better recognize the abilities of others and appreciate them.
yeah, I think too often though we see like other people doing something and failing, and we kind of externalize it. Like think, how many times have you and people around you watched American Idol, right? And somebody goes up there just so naive and oblivious, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna be the next big thing, I'm a great singer, I'm gonna be on Broadway next fall. And they go up there and they start singing, and it's just horrendous. It's just terrible. Like that's half the reason that people watch American Idol. It's to watch people with just complete delusion, a complete lack of understanding of their skill set, go up there and kind of make a fool out of themselves.
I've never watched American Idol.
Really? Okay. Well, you'll get people all the time because they'll go to a city and it's open to just anyone.
I believe it. Yeah.
I mean, the same's true with
like
what's the new stuff, like American Ninja Warrior or the X Factor,
I get it.
things
The
like
voice.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To some degree, they probably specifically show some of the more egregious ones for viewership because it's funny for people to watch.
Yeah, that's fine. But my point here is still that like the level of disconnect between what we can personally do and what we see other people doing is so
Right,
high.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to have that humility about your own abilities, where maybe you don't have the greatest of abilities, in order to recognize or have a sense of reverence for the abilities that people do have, and the beautiful and wonderful art that others are able to produce.
Yeah, when I was in like kind of late high school, I trained jujitsu for a while, and I was right at that age where I wasn't quite an adult, but I was definitely too old for like the kids classes. So I would go to the adult classes, and the owner of the gym would always without fail, if there was some like kind of young hot-headed wrestling guy, right, he would always stick those guys on me the first time. And what would happen every single time without fail is these guys they'd be all jumpy, all over the place, trying to move fast, trying to just do anything that they could. And I'd slowly wear them down and submit them. And these guys came in just so hot-headed, and they had no understanding of what they were getting into, but their confidence level was so high. And I mean, jiu-jitsu is kind of an art form in a very different way. I'm not saying that it's like 80% art necessarily, but there's an art to it. And I think that disconnect is just it's made so apparent in some of these instances, like when you start grappling with someone, when you go on television to sing in front of a crowd of 1,000 people.
Yeah.
Right? Push comes to shove. It's so straightforward, but the average everyday person isn't confronted with things like that.
Well, I think that's also why it's important and interesting, and I'm a huge advocate of just like trying to do different things.
Yeah.
Go try to make like a little, short film, or go try to like take some pictures. Go try to make a little song.
Mm-hmm.
You're probably going to suck at it if you've never done it before.
Yeah.
But that's the best way to learn how to appreciate something. Like the same way that these photos from Gregory Crewdson, I'm never going to look at those photos the same way again, because I have this deeper reverence for them now. Or, you know, in high school when I went through a whole, like, I'm going to make little short films because I just really liked doing that. Like, I got a better understanding and appreciation for how difficult it is to do that well. And now I can appreciate really good films in a way that I might not have been able to if I didn't ever try that.
Yeah.
And I'm a huge advocate of that kind of thing. Try something out, you know, try different things. And not that you have to have a million hobbies and do all of them, but at the very least, you can come away with a different or better understanding than you went into it with.
Yeah. I think a lot of times when I see people like trying something out for the first time from an art standpoint, I see a couple of things. One is just kind of like a copy of somebody else's art or what somebody else did. And then kind of a derivative of that I see is people like falling into like a trend. I see this a lot in like home design, which to me is a great example of like a minor level art form that the everyday person experiences.
Sure.
And so often, like right now, I'm sure this is going to age, but right now, like the trend is these
the brass
like
cabinet
brushed,
pulls.
kind of gold,
green
bronze,
cabinets, white shiplap.
White shiplap, the odd colored cabinets, whether it's like a royal blue or it's like a forest green. You also get certain styles where they have matte black fixtures on everything, like a matte black faucet, or kitchens that have white on white on white on white on white. These to me are things that are just so trendy and are emblematic of a complete lack of understanding of the art in its fundamental form. Like to me, the best artists make art that is timeless, that stands the test of time. You know, like time is a very harsh judge. It's difficult to make a car that looks great 50 years later. Like if you go back and you look at like old 30, 40-year-old Hondas, they do not hold up the same that like an old 911 does.
Yeah.
You don't like old cars, but you have to admit even like old 911s look great.
That
still.
Is an interesting thing about architecture too. Like certain beauty and different kinds of architecture, you can see how they've held up and remained beautiful. Like, you know, obviously there's a level of different people have different styles, but beautiful ornate wood details on homes from the early 1900s that you get, classic brick homes, like even things like mid-century modern type homes, like that's, you know, one of my personal favorites. From, I think those really got popular in like maybe the 60s or something. But those types of homes, even today, like the architecture is just still like seems like ahead of its time in a sense. Contrast that with, in my mind, homes that were built in the 80s or the 90s already feel dated. A lot of the time.
Yeah,
like
I agree.
The if we're going into the 90s, the builder basic honey oak everywhere, the gold shiny fixtures and trim around the showers, like these things have not held up well. Like people already don't like them. Contrast that with things like ornate wood railings in old homes or clawfoot tubs. Like it's not my personal style. I don't love clawfoot tubs, but I recognize like there's a level of charm or historic beauty to it. A lot of people love that kind of stuff. People look for character, charm, like beautiful fireplaces, things like that. The fireplaces in homes that were built in suburban 90s, right? They all had this exact same brick just around the whole thing and basic like orange wood mantle. Like every single person had a fireplace that looked like this in the 90s. Like already now it's like, oh, gross. People don't like those anymore.
Yeah, I think that obviously this is a little bit above the residential level, but this was made so painstakingly obvious and clear to me when I was in DC. You have two dominant styles of government buildings in Washington, D.C. One is the classic Greco-Roman style. So think like the White House. That's like a perfect example of this. Okay? This style is something that is unbelievably beautiful, wildly timeless, and will never grow old, ever. And then, by contrast, I would see these brick buildings that were built...
Like the 70s, 80s, right?
I think it's like late 80s, early 90s.
It's that age. Age, they were not good at architecture.
It was just this abysmal brick. It looked so, like, dark. There was no, like, style to it, really. It was just very blockish and dark, and it was not inspiring in any way. Versus you'd go to, like, you'd walk down the National Mall, and just thing after thing is unbelievably beautiful. You'd walk by the White House, and it's awe-inspiring.
Right, and that's just, I mean, architecture in the U.S. doesn't even stand the test of time to the same degree as, you know, stuff you get in Europe.
Yeah.
That's been there for hundreds upon hundreds of years.
Yeah, I can only imagine, like, some of these really old Scottish castles or beautiful ornate cathedrals. Oh my gosh. The streets of Rome. It's probably stunning.
Never been there. Not yet.
Not yet, no. Yeah. I think getting out and seeing different pieces of art and then giving it a shot for yourself really can provide a level of insight that you didn't have before. Like, I came to a lot of that understanding when I went out and tried to make, like, some song to rival a crappy pop song at the time.
Yeah.
And you understood this when you went out and took some pictures. Like, I would really encourage people to go out and try stuff for yourself. You know, and when you finish the thing, I think context really matters. Like, try and compare it to, like, initially you can kind of compare it to what you were doing before or people around you, but then also compare it to that which is aspirational. Compare it to people that actually make a living doing this. I think people can get iteratively better, but even if you decide after a few tries at things that, yeah, painting's not for me or making music's not for me, that's fine, but I think that it lends a degree of understanding that you would not otherwise have. If you guys do end up giving some of that a shot, you know, write to us. Let us know how that went. Shoot us a voice recording. Let us know how your experience was. Maybe send in your art if you're daring enough.
Send in a picture. Try to see if you can do better than me at the the so basic, simple street photos.
Yeah. I think art's so critical to the human condition and really speaks to something deep, and I think that going through and understanding that better is really an exercise in kind of interacting with the divine, and hopefully something that we as a society and as individuals can do more going forward. With that, it's getting late, but I've been musing about saying yes or saying no to things. You know, I know a lot of people out there struggle saying no to things or, you know, overcommitting themselves. I've been thinking that, you know, for every yes that you say to something, really, there's also like an infinite set of no's that you're saying simultaneously, because you can only do one thing at a time. I think myself especially, and probably a lot of people, need to get better at saying no to things, even things that may be good. right? Maybe even things that you want to do. But sometimes we have to say no to one good thing so that we can say yes to an even better thing. Sometimes this even happens with entire categories of things. So like for me, I mentioned earlier in the podcast that, I don't play any musical instruments, and sometimes I'm kind of saddened by this and wish it was something that I was able to experience, but at the same time I kind of remind myself that there are only so many hours in a given day, and if I did want to play an instrument or have learned one by this point, I would have had to sacrifice a number of hours that went into other things. And life is really about those sacrifices, and I think people, myself included, need to be really thoughtful about what we're saying yes to, because while we think it's simple and easy to say yes, it's also an infinite set of no's. And I think putting that into perspective and understanding it in that way kind of re-parameterizes and gives a different perspective on things. Well, with that, it's getting late. Thank you everyone for listening. Again, if you've got topics you want to hear us talk about, feel free to write in. The email is secondpartypodcast@gmail.com. Thank you again, and have a good night.